The county called the orange flags a correction. Ruth Calder called them a warning. Because those flags did not just move a property line. They pointed straight through the old Shelterbelt her husband had planted after the flood of 1983. 2 rows of black locust, 1 row of hedge apple, a ragged wall of roots, thorns, shade, and memory running along the west edge of her farm. To the men from Astor Ridge Energy, it looked like a nuisance. To Ruth, it was the only reason her 260 acres still had soil on them. And when the first excavator tore into those roots, Ruth did not scream. She did not beg. She simply looked at the young project manager in his clean white hard hat and said, "You just opened something you do not know how to close." Ruth Calder was 71 years old, though nobody in Beckett County treated that number like weakness. She still drove fence posts by hand when the ground was soft enough. She still changed oil in her own combine. And she still kept a coffee can of rusted shear bolts on the kitchen windowsill. Because her late husband, Daniel, had always said, a farmer should keep broken parts where he could remember what broke them. Their farm sat outside Bellwether, Iowa, in a shallow basin the locals called the Saucer. It was beautiful land, black dirt, heavy clay underneath, flat enough to see a storm coming half an hour before it arrived. But it was not forgiving land. When the wind came out of the west, it came like it had a legal right to take whatever was loose. That was why Daniel planted the Shelterbelt, not for decoration, not for shade, not because he liked trees. He planted it after the 1983 flood, when the county drainage tiles backed up, the west ditch overtopped, and 6 inches of Ruth's topsoil slid across the road like chocolate batter. Daniel came home from a drainage board meeting with muddy boots, a rolled survey map, and 300 saplings in the bed of his pickup. Ruth had laughed at him then. "Trees won't stop water," she said. Daniel tapped the map with one dirty finger. "No," he told her, "but roots hold the ground that tells water where to go." For 38 years, he was right. The Shelterbelt broke the wind before it hit the corn. It caught snow before it buried the cattle lot. It kept the west ditch from chewing sideways during spring rain. And under the thickest hedge apple roots, where Ruth almost never let the mower get close, there was an old square of concrete Daniel had always warned her not to disturb. A maintenance cap, he called it. Part of the county's buried drainage network. Nothing glamorous, just one of those dull rural facts that kept a farm alive while nobody in town thought about it. Then the neighboring farm sold. The Whitcomb place had been won. 700 acres of corn, pasture, waterways, and worn-out family arguments. After old Lawrence Whitcomb died, his children did what children often do when they inherit land they do not intend to touch. They sold it to the highest bidder. Astor Ridge Energy paid $18.6 million through a holding company nobody in Bellwether had heard of until the signs went up. Future home of Prairie Light Solar. A 160-megawatt project, the newspaper said, millions in county revenue. Short-term construction jobs, a clean energy landmark for the region. At the ribbon announcement, the county supervisor smiled so hard, Ruth thought his face might crack. Astor Ridge sent a regional development director named Evan Marlowe to speak. He was 36, smooth, well-fed, and wore new boots that had never made a decision in mud. He talked about transition. He talked about stewardship. He talked about partnering with the community. 3 days later, he drove his black electric pickup down Ruth's lane and parked beside Daniel's old machine shed. Ruth was in the yard, sharpening a mower blade on a bench grinder. "Mrs. Calder," Evan said, stepping carefully around a puddle. "I'm Evan Marlowe, Astor Ridge Energy." Ruth shut off the grinder. "I know who bought Whitcomb." He smiled like he had already decided she would be difficult and was enjoying the performance. I wanted to introduce myself personally. We've been reviewing our preliminary layout, and there's one small boundary issue we'd love to resolve neighbor to neighbor. Boundary issues are rarely small, Ruth said. Evan opened a tablet case and showed her a glossy satellite image. Her Shelterbelt appeared as a dark green seam between her land and the Whitcomb parcel. Our panel rose along the eastern edge, lose late-day exposure because of these trees, he said. Not all year, mostly peak production season. But over a project this size, that shade translates into measurable output loss. How measurable? Roughly 6% on that section. Ruth looked at the screen. You came here to buy my trees. We came to offer compensation for removing an obstruction, Evan said, still smiling. Astor Ridge would cover clearing costs and pay you $75,000 for the strip. Ruth wiped her hands on a rag. Those trees are not a strip. They're a Shelterbelt. They're my husband's work. Evan's smile thinned. I respect that. But we're talking about progress. The county is behind us. The state is behind us. There are federal incentives tied to the construction schedule. This project is bigger than one hedgerow. Ruth stepped closer to the tablet and tapped the dark line with one cracked fingernail. That hedgerow is bigger than your project. Evan blinked. Then he laughed once softly. Mrs. Calder, with respect, we can make this easy. With respect, Mr. Marlowe, you can make your truck point back toward the road. He left with his money still in his folder. But Ruth knew men like Evan did not leave a problem alone. They only changed the name on it. 2 weeks later, the survey flags appeared. Orange stakes ran past the old fence by nearly 18 feet, cutting directly into the Shelterbelt. Ruth pulled one out and carried it to the county office. Supervisor Dale Ketteridge would not look at her when she laid it on his desk. Astor Ridge commissioned a licensed survey, he said. From Omaha, Ruth replied. By a company that had never stepped on this section until last Tuesday. Ruth, property descriptions get corrected all the time. That fence has stood there since 1949. Old fences are not law. Neither is a check with a surveyor's name on it. Ketteridge's jaw tightened. You can dispute it in court. With what money? He folded his hands like a man practicing patience for church. Astor Ridge is bringing in tax revenue this county badly needs. I am not stopping a permitted energy project over a fence line disagreement. Ruth picked up the orange flag. Then she leaned over his desk. Dale, that line is not where they think it is. He sighed. Go home, Ruth. So she did, and the next morning, Astor Ridge brought in the mulchers. They did not clear the entire Shelterbelt. That would have looked too much like theft. They only took the western row, the hedge apple, the thick, twisted, thorn-armored trees that Daniel had chosen because cattle would not walk through them, wind would not slip under them, and roots would go down like iron fingers. Ruth stood on her side of the torn earth while the machines chewed Daniel's trees into yellow chips. Evan Marlowe watched from beside a white sight truck. He wore a hard hat and a rain jacket with the Astor Ridge logo on the chest. When Ruth walked toward him, one of his safety men raised a hand. She ignored him. Evan said, Our survey puts this within the Whitcomb parcel. Ruth stared at the splintered stumps. You are cutting the bones out of this ground. We're clearing shade. You are clearing the thing that kept this basin from moving. He glanced toward the open 1,700 acres behind him, already scraped clean of fence rows, waterways, volunteer trees, and cover misses. Calder, our engineers know how to manage runoff. Then why is your topsoil already in my ditch? His face hardened. This conversation is over. Ruth turned to the torn Shelterbelt. The air smelled like sap and hot hydraulic oil. It smelled like a wound. Astor Ridge had promised minimal disturbance. Instead, they turned the Whitcomb farm into a brown construction pan. They disked under cover crop, pulled old grass waterways, filled low swales, leveled everything that made a farm uneven enough to survive weather. The environmental consultant had recommended temporary rye, silt fencing, and a sprayed binder to hold the soil until the steel posts went in. Evan rejected most of it. Too expensive, too slow, unnecessary if the pile drivers stayed on schedule. For 10 days the wind stayed quiet, then the pressure dropped. By mid-afternoon, Ruth saw the western sky turn the color of dirty wool. The first gust hit hard enough to rattle Daniel's coffee can on the sill. Then the open Whitcomb ground lifted, not dust from a field, not the ordinary gray haze of spring planting, a black wall. The stripped topsoil rose off in 700 acres and moved east with nothing to break it. Before Astor Ridge, the Whitcomb hedgerows would have staggered the wind. Before Evan's survey, Daniel's hedge apple row would have caught the grit low and heavy. Now the dust came through the wounded Shelterbelt like smoke through broken ribs. For 2 days, Ruth lived inside a brown world. Silt hissed against the siding. It crept under doors. It coated plates in the cupboard and settled into the lines of Daniel's photograph on the mantel. When the sky finally cleared, Ruth walked the farm with a scarf tied across her mouth. Her early bean stand was shredded, tender leaves cut clean off by blown grit. The west ditch was half filled with Astor Ridge soil. 2 calves had swollen eyes. The air filter on her loader was packed solid. And in the machine shed, her combine's intake looked like someone had fed it cake flour. She took a quart jar, filled it with the black dirt that had drifted against her porch, and drove to the courthouse. This time, she did not ask to speak with Ketteridge. She walked into his office and poured the dirt onto his carpet. "That is Whitcomb ground," she said. "Your project put it in my house." Ketteridge stood so fast his chair hit the wall. "Have you lost your mind?" "No. But you might lose your drainage district if they keep working that boundary." He froze for half a second. Then the official face returned. It was a wind event. It was negligence. It was weather. It was sifting 700 acres stripped bare and 1 Shelterbelt row cut out under a crooked survey. Ketteridge lowered his voice. "Ruth, listen carefully. You cannot fight them this way. They have attorneys, engineers, insurance, state permits. You have an old fence and a grievance. I have a farm, and they have a schedule." That was when Ruth understood. Nobody in that building was going to protect the land because nobody in that building had to live on it. So she went home. She parked by the machine shed. She stood for a long moment in the yard, looking at the torn Shelterbelt, the orange flags, the pile of yellow hedge chips where Daniel's trees had stood. Then she went into the basement. Daniel's drainage files were in a metal seed box beneath the canning shelves. Ruth had not opened it since the funeral. Inside were plat books, meeting minutes, hand-labeled envelopes, faded county maps, and a blue engineering plan rolled around a cedar stick. She cleared the basement table and spread it flat. Bexkanky Drainage District 7. Lateral C Relief Structure. Revsid 1981. Ruth leaned closer. There it was. The Whitcomb Basin drained through 3 buried tile mains that converged near the old fence line, then passed beneath Ruth's west ditch toward the creek. But before the water crossed onto the Calder farm, the engineers had built a pressure relief vault. A concrete box 12 feet below the surface, 4 feet wide, 6 feet long, covered by reinforced slab, designed to keep storm surge from blowing the tiles apart when the saucer filled too fast. Ruth traced Daniel's pencil notes in the margin. Root mat must remain undisturbed. Hedgerow stabilizes cap zone. No heavy compaction over vault. Her hand stopped. The vault sat exactly under the western hedge apple row. Not on Astor Ridgeland, not 18 feet west. exactly where the old fence, the old plat, and Daniel's warning had always placed it. Evan had not just removed trees. He had removed the living brace over a pressure point in the county's drainage system. And according to Astor Ridge's posted work schedule, the pile drivers were starting that same boundary line on Monday. Ruth sat back in Daniel's chair. For the first time in weeks, she smiled, not because she wanted destruction, because the land had finally given her a witness no lawyer could bully. On Saturday morning, Ruth hitched the back blade to her tractor. By noon, she had started cutting a diversion swale on her side of the property line. Not deep enough to look dramatic, just enough to give water a path. She shaped it toward the county road ditch, then opened the old grassed waterway Daniel had kept clean for decades. She moved her cattle to the north lot. She parked the loader and combine on the highest gravel near the machine shed. She pulled the old drainage maps, sealed them in a plastic sleeve, and placed them in her truck. Near dusk, a local foreman named Cal Peters stopped by the fence. Cal had grown up 2 farms south and now worked for the contractor Astor Ridge had hired. He looked at the fresh swale. "Ruth," he called, "what are you building? An apology for gravity." He took off his cap and scratched his head. "A what?" "Move your rigs off the west line before the rain." Cal looked toward the solar site. "They're starting posts there Monday." "I know. The forecast is bad, but it's not biblical." Ruth leaned on the tractor wheel. "Cal, do you remember Daniel's rule about the saucer?" He nodded slowly. "Never trust dry ground in a wet week." "Then listen to him one more time." Cal looked past her at the ripped Shelterbelt, then at the orange flags. His face changed. "I'll tell them," he said. But Evan Marlowe was not listening to Foreman anymore. Astor Ridge was 13 days behind schedule. Concrete deliveries had been shifted. Panel racks were waiting in staging lots. A financing benchmark depended on the first 1,000 posts being driven before the end of the month. On Monday morning, the rain came before sunrise. Not a sprinkle, not a spring shower, a cold, heavy, straight-down rain that made the yard shine silver. By 10 o'clock, Beckett County had taken 3 inches. By noon, almost 5. The Whitcomb site became a lake broken by tire ruts. Water sheeted across the stripped ground because there were no roots left to take it in, no grass waterways left to slow it, and no open soil structure left after weeks of machine compaction. The rain found the lowest place, the west boundary, the place where the hedge apple roots were gone. Inside Astor Ridge's mobile office, Evan stood over a schedule board while water ran down the windows. Cal Peters kept his radio close to his mouth. "I'm telling you, that boundary is soft," he said. "The rig is already walking sideways." "Then put mats down," Evan snapped. "Mats won't fix standing water. We drive the line today. We should wait 24 hours. Evan turned toward the glass. Beyond the office, a 52-ton hydraulic pile driver crawled through the rain, its steel track sinking 2 inches into the mud. "If we wait," Evan said, "we miss the milestone. Drive the line." Cal hesitated. Then the radio clicked. "Copy." Ruth heard the first hammer strike from her kitchen. The sound rolled through the ground and trembled in the window glass. She set down her coffee. Another strike, then another. Each blow drove a galvanized steel post into the saturated soil along the wounded boundary. Down below, the pressure relief vault was already loaded. Floodwater from the Whitcomb Basin surged through the 3 tile mains, striking the old concrete chamber with more force than it had seen in years. The soil around it, once netted tight by hedge apple roots, had been torn open, ground, compacted, soaked, and hammered. The 4th post hit something it should never have touched. The operator felt it first. Not resistance, a drop. The post lurched downward too fast. Then the ground exhaled. A column of brown water exploded 30 feet into the air. The steel post shot back upward out of the hole, twisting like a thrown spear before slamming flat into the mud. The pile driver rocked hard to the left. Cal screamed through the radio, back out now, but there was no ground left to back onto. The soil opened in a circle around the machine, turning from mud to slurry in seconds. One track disappeared, then the other. The operator threw the door open and jumped into waist-deep water just as the rig tilted, groaned, and sank nose first into the collapsing hole. The pressure relief vault had failed, and once it failed, the whole saucer looked for a new mouth. Water roared out of the broken chamber, carrying tile fragments, clay, gravel, and a century of buried black soil. It hit Ruth's side first, but Ruth's swale caught the leading edge, turned it south, and fed it into Daniel's old grassed waterway. The water ran hard, it ran ugly, but it ran where it had been given permission to run. On the Astor Ridge side, there was no such mercy. The stripped solar field was flat, sealed, and lower than the staging yard. The flood spread backward across 1,700 acres. It lifted pallets of panel brackets. It swallowed copper spools. It shoved crates of photovoltaic modules into one another until the glass cracked in bright, useless webs. Gravel access roads peeled away. Survey stakes vanished. A 6-figure transformer cabinet rolled onto its side like a toy chest. By evening, the first rows of Prairie Light Solar were no longer a construction site. They were a brown inland sea with a drowned pile driver sticking out of it. The rain stopped after midnight. Morning came pale and cold. Ruth walked to the west line in rubber boots with Daniel's drainage map under her coat. The sinkhole was wider than her machine shed. Concrete chunks lay in the mud like broken teeth. The pile driver's cab was half submerged. Only the top of its hammer assembly showed above the water, tilted at an angle that made it look embarrassed. 3 vehicles arrived before 9, a county truck, Astor Ridge's black pickup, and a state utility emergency vehicle with amber lights still spinning. Evan Marlowe stepped out first. He looked smaller without clean ground under him. His hard hat was crooked. Mud covered his pants to the knee. His face had the gray look of a man who had finally met a consequence he could not rename. "You did this," he shouted. Ruth stopped at the old fence line. "I made water a ditch. You sabotaged a permitted energy project." "No," Ruth said. "You drove steel through a drainage vault." He pointed toward her swale. "You redirected the flood. I redirected my floodwater away from my barn. You built a lake." County Supervisor Ketteridge climbed from the county truck, staring at the sinkhole like it might reach up and pull him in. Behind him came a woman in a state jacket, Mara Voss, Iowa Infrastructure Safety Division. Ruth recognized the name from the emergency notice Ketteridge had tried not to send. Voss looked at the crater, then at Ruth. "Mrs. Calder?" Ruth nodded. "You said on the phone you had district records." "I do." Evan barked a laugh. "Oh, for God's sake. She has a box of farm papers, and suddenly she's an engineer." Ruth did not answer him. She walked to the hood of the state truck, pulled the plastic sleeve from under her coat, and unrolled Daniel's 1981 drainage plan. The paper was yellowed at the edges, but the lines were clear. The old fence, the Whitcomb Basin, the 3 tile mains, the pressure relief vault, the hedgerow marked in Daniel's tight block handwriting. Mara Voss leaned over the map. Ketteridge leaned too. Evan stayed where he was. Ruth tapped the vault symbol. "This is what your post hit. Lateral C relief structure, built in 1981 after the big flood." Daniel Calder was on the drainage board. He planted the hedge apple row to stabilize the cap zone because the soil moved there every spring. Voss looked up sharply. "There was an easement?" Ruth pulled a second page from the sleeve, recorded with the district. "Maintenance access by county permission only. No heavy compaction over the vault. No excavation without drainage board review. Ketteridge went white. Evan stepped forward. That cannot be current. Ruth looked at him then. Really looked. You never checked. The rainwater dripped from the drowned machinery. No one spoke. Not Evan. Not Ketteridge. Not the workers gathered at the road. Because the map did what Ruth's anger could not do. It made the truth visible. Within 48 hours, the state suspended work along the entire site. Within a week, Astor Ridge's insurer refused immediate coverage pending negligence review. The county ordered an independent boundary survey using the original plat, the drainage district records, and the easement description. The old fence line held. The orange flags disappeared. Evan Marlowe disappeared sooner. Astor Ridge called it a personnel transition. Bellwether called it what it was. The man who moved the line had been moved off the project. The drainage repair took most of the summer. It cost more than the Shelterbelt had ever shaded and lost production. Astor Ridge had to rebuild waterways, restore silt controls, replace damaged panels, and refile its environmental plan from scratch. Ruth did not get Daniel's hedge apple row back, not the old one. Trees do not return because a state agency admits a mistake. So in October, when the ground cooled and the rain softened the clay, Ruth planted a new row. Not alone. Cal Peters came. So did 2 Whitcomb grandchildren. So did 3 county workers who arrived with shovels and said almost nothing. Even Ketteridge sent a crew to reset the fence. Ruth planted hedge apple again. Slow trees. Stubborn trees. Trees that did not grow for appearances. At the last hole, she pressed the soil around a thin green sapling and heard Daniel's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside her. Roots hold the ground that tells water where to go. Astor Ridge had trusted a fresh survey. Ruth had trusted the ground, and the ground remembered.